I'm just going to hand it over to, again, Bianca Mobius-Clune, who is our National Climate and Soil Health Initiative Director, and she and the rest of her team are going to start in on soil health basics. And we will have you, I'm just checking now that I pause. This is an hour and a half, correct, Bianca? So
that's what I understand, yes.
Okay, and so in an hour and a half from now, you will be on your way for the rest of the day. But Bianca, to you. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to welcome you all, and I'm really excited to get to spend this time with you. I think you all hold the power to the path to a stronger agriculture. It's right there under your feet and under everybody's feet who you work with on a daily basis. You all, I don't know whether we've figured out how many thousands of acres or more you all have influence over across all of the land trusts that are represented here across all of the states that we have. I think it is absolutely fantastic that you all are here, that you all are interested. I know very little about land protection, and I feel so grateful to be able to work with all of my awesome colleagues and partners of AFT to expand soil health and the adoption of soil health practices across the nation, because I think there's so much potential to create a much better agriculture. I can't do anything on my own. I always need big teams. You all are here. I hope that we all work together in the long run to make this happen, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where you all take this and how this helps you do your work better. So with that, I'm going to be talking about building high-functioning and resilient healthy soils and regenerative systems during this next hour and a half and tomorrow and the next day. I'm always talking about soil health. I'm really passionate about it. I hope to be able to pass that on in a way that is helpful to you all. Today, I will be speaking for most of it, but I will bring in the awesome voices of two staff of mine, Dr. Rachel Seaman-Varner and Dr. Bonnie McGill, and also the voices of some colleagues of mine who worked with me founding the Soil Health Division, Ray Archuleta and Doug Peterson, through some YouTube videos that we will look at. So more than just me, hopefully that means that that is more interesting. So objectives for the soil health journey that you all are about to take this week. I am hoping that where we go is that by the time you're done with this course, you really kind of understand why soil health matters so much and what the benefits are, that you can describe what soil health is and how soil health relates to regenerative agriculture and climate resiliency, and that you can talk a little bit enough to a producer that you might get them excited and wanting to hear more about soil health management systems, principles, and conservation practices that can improve soil health. And I'm hoping also to get some good discussion going today, and then we'll dive more into barriers of adoption tomorrow, because there's a number of them, and I bet that those of you who have talked with growers about any of these practices, you've encountered some of those barriers. I want to say here first that while I've been in the soil health space, I've been in the soil health space for a long time, but I'm still learning every day too. So those of you who are just starting, awesome, welcome. Those of you who are continuing, please keep on continuing. And if you ever find yourself thinking, gosh, I don't know enough, it's not true. You know, whatever you know is better than not knowing anything. And every day, any of us can learn more. So don't be afraid. Don't keep yourself from it. Because you bring value to this with all of the stuff that you know, and we need everybody to contribute that value so that we can all take this journey together and get our farmers across the country hopefully adopting these practices and systems and creating a better agriculture. So today I'll talk through introductions to the basics and benefits of soil health. Tomorrow I'll introduce soil health management principles a little bit today, and then tomorrow we'll spend a lot more time on the principles and on practices, particularly in the West with some of my colleagues, especially Marlon Winger. We'll talk about a whole lot of the systems that are working in the West. And then tomorrow also we'll dive into the barriers to adoption. So I'll start with some of the challenges, right? This is what we're facing. We have a changing climate. We have population growth. We have food security issues. We have farm economy issues, water quality, water quantity haven't been improving. If anything, they're getting worse. Air quality issues, human health issues, consumer demands are changing. And we have a loss of our agricultural soils to development and to degradation. And while there's a lot of debate around climate and what we do about it, there's not really debate about whether it exists and whether humans are causing it. The debate is more around, you know, how drastic is it going to be? But we can see across the country that farmers are bearing the brunt of climate change. They're experiencing droughts, they're experiencing floods, and those are really difficult to handle challenges. And so we need to build more resilient systems so that farming can continue, so that we can continue to have food security. Water quantity and reliability is a big challenge for producers these days. They face pests and disease pressures, risks, price issues that they're having. Inputs are extremely expensive right now. Markets can often be troublesome, especially when you're changing systems. So that's something for us all to be aware of. Loss of land access is difficult. Consumer needs are difficult to meet. So we can talk about all these challenges, and maybe the first reaction that a lot of people have to seeing all that is, oh my goodness, that's way too much trouble. I don't even want to go there. I'm shutting down. I'm going to open my book. I'm going to go watch some TV. I'm going to go have a snack, right? It can be depressing to hear about all the problems. But what I'm here to say is the reason I'm passionate about soil health is that I feel like it is a win-win solution, and that it is actually one solution toward all of these issues that we just talked about. It's not a silver bullet. Soil health isn't going to fix everything. Soil health is not going to change the weather. It can contribute, because through soil health, we can sequester carbon. We can contribute to resolving the climate challenges we have. But soil health is one solution in the system that is a really critical one that we get a lot of benefits from. So I want you all to look at soil health with me here and explore how amazing those benefits are and how they can start to address some of those challenges that we're facing, and how we can empower our producers out there to be part of a solution and really help them get that message. I think producers often get a lot of pushback and a lot of, you're bad, you know, it's the conservationists against agriculture. But I think agriculture is actually a conservation solution, because our agricultural managers manage so much land, the vast majority of land that we're doing anything with, right? It's in their hands. And in my experience, most producers really do want to maintain their land, keep it resilient, and they face some challenges, and we can hopefully help with some of those. I love looking at this quote, because Hugh Hammond Bennett, the founder of NRCS, back then Soil Conservation Service, said back in 1943, if we are bold in our thinking, courageous in accepting new ideas, and willing to work with instead of against our land, we shall find in conservation farming an avenue to the greatest food production the world has ever known. I think that is absolutely visionary. It is really inspirational. And what he was saying back then still holds today. So I think that that's really exciting, that way back then, 80 years ago, here's this guy who already understood this. And here today, when we talk about soil health, this is really what we're talking about. Conservation farming, regenerative agriculture, soil health management systems. There's a lot of overlap between all of those spaces. When I got to NRCS, a lot of people approached me and said, I was going to retire, but then soil health came along and got me really excited and made me stay. So there's fantastic stuff going on with soil health, and we all get to be part of it. So I lost my ability to change my slides. There we go. What is it that we're looking for from our soils, right? I recognize we have a broad diversity of levels of knowledge about soil health in this room. Everybody brings a lot of stuff. You all know what you know really well. Soils, some of you have been thinking about soils forever, and some of you, this is kind of the first time that you're really diving in. I want to be aware of that. If anybody wants to contribute, if you want to contribute your knowledge, please do. As we get into question and answer type sessions, I would love for folks to share your experience, because some of you know a lot more about Western systems than I do. Most of my experience is more on the East Coast. But at the very basic level, what is it that we're looking for our soils to do, right? What functions would we like our soils to provide? Well, they produce food, feed, fiber, biofuels, medicine, flowers, you know, whatever words you want to put in there, right? They're a production foundation. They capture, filter, and store water. They cycle and recycle nutrients. They produce resilience to drought, to flood, and to temperature extremes when the systems are managed right. We're expecting our soils to protect plants from pathogens and stress, to detoxify pollutants, to store carbon and moderate the release of greenhouse gases and other gases. They are to resist erosive forces so that they stick around so that we can continue to use those soils for all the things that we need. And they're a habitat for biodiversity. That's a lot of stuff we're expecting from our soils. So what do we need to do? How can we maintain our soils in a way that all those functions remain? That's at the crux of soil health and learning how to manage for healthy soils. I'm going to step even one more step backwards and say, okay, so soils, soil health, what's so special about soil? For some of you who maybe have never really taken a soils course, never taken an environmental science class, you know, haven't really learned about soils, why is soil so important? Well, I like to think of soil as an interface and a foundation. It is foundational to everything. I taught classes to kids during grad school for a little while as a NSF K through 12 fellow, teamed up with teachers, and I would challenge the students in those classes, and I would say, okay, tell me anything and we'll figure out a way it relates to soil. And it always worked. We always found some way to draw it back because it is that foundational. Soils are at the foundation of our water systems, our minerals, of life, and of the air, right? There's a lot of exchange that happens between all of these systems. And those soils need to have all those functions so that all these systems, life on Earth, our water cycle, all of the air exchange that happens, our weathering of minerals and all the nutrients that come from that, right? All of that needs to work. And soils are foundational to that. What are soils? What are they made of? At a very basic level, these percentages here are, they changed based on the kind of soil, based on how it's been managed. But at a very basic level, you can think of soils as containing about half solid stuff and half empty space. The solid stuff is mostly generally mineral matter. There are some soils that have a lot of organic matter, but most soils are mostly mineral matter in that solid part. And then there's organic matter in that soil, and that organic matter is an incredibly important part of soils. That's where a lot of the carbon is stored, and that drives function of those soils in a very major kind of way, much more major than the 5% of volume that it takes up. 5%, 1%, 10%, 0.2%, right? That percentage of organic matter can change a lot, and it's very much at the core of whether a soil is healthy or not. But now we get to the empty spaces, right? The empty spaces in the soil are called pores, and in a fairly well-functioning soil, you might think you have about half of the soil volume taken up by pores. That's where interesting stuff happens. That empty space is where water is stored, where water moves, where dissolved nutrients are in that water and can be accessed by plants. There's a lot of air in those pores, and all those organisms that are living in those pores, all those biota, from roots of plants to various other organisms that we'll talk about, all of those organisms, a lot of those organisms need air. And so we need to make sure that we've got enough air, that we've got enough water in those soils. So that's the basic makeup of soils. Now, when we start thinking about soil health, health is something that we all can relate to because we are human beings and we think about our health occasionally, at least. And it's very much something that's personal. People actually used to talk about these concepts as soil quality. It's a little bit different, but often you'll hear soil quality and soil health used interchangeably. Soil quality was used by researchers for a long time, and it didn't really stick in the public realm. And when people started really talking about soil health, that started to stick more because people could relate to it more. NRCS has defined soil health as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. That definition is important, and we can look at the various components of it. And the critical parts of this are all right there in that fairly short definition, right? It's a continued capacity. That soil has to continue to function to remain healthy. We need all of those functions that we just talked about, all of the processes that happen in soils associated with that. We need that capacity to function to continue into the long term, because it's what keeps us alive. It's what keeps everything else alive, right? It is a vital living ecosystem. Soils are an ecosystem. And we often think about ecosystems as above ground, right? We're somewhat familiar with the jungles. We might be familiar with ocean ecosystems, with the forests of wherever we live, right? We think of that as ecosystems, but below ground, there are ecosystems. And those ecosystems have billions of organisms. And all of those organisms drive soil function, that continued capacity to do all of those things we just talked about. And all of those functions sustain life on Earth. I like to talk to folks about aggregate stability and aggregates in soil, because they're fascinating to talk about, especially when you think about that ecosystem and you think about all those little particles of sand, silt, and clay sticking together. Who does that? It's the organisms. All those organisms that are in the soil, which, by the way, if you take a handful of soil, there are more organisms in it than there are people on Earth. So everybody here and all of the farmers that you work with, no matter whether they have cows or not, or any other animals that are above ground, everybody is a livestock farmer, because everybody has livestock below ground. If you've got a little garden, you're a livestock farmer. If you've got a pot of soil on your windowsill, it probably has microbes in it too, so you're a livestock farmer, right? You've just got some below ground or in soil organisms. Aggregates are absolutely critical, and they are created by microbes. Aggregates are those crumbles. So if you think of digging up a handful of soil, if it looks a little bit like cottage cheese but dark brown, that's what I'm talking about in terms of aggregates, those kind of crumbly round pieces. And those aggregates, when they are stable, have pores in between them. And those pores, the small pores, the large pores, the intermediate pores, are absolutely critical to soil function. Those pores are created by the organisms that live in that soil, including the plant roots and everything associated with them. All of the interesting stuff is happening in those empty spaces, right? When you have a downpour, it goes into those large pores. It gets sucked into the sponge. It gets held by some pores. Some of it drains down into the groundwater. That's where the really interesting stuff is going on, is in those empty spaces. And so if you think of soils, think for a moment that basically there's a megacity down there. You are, when you're standing on soil, standing on top of billions and billions and billions of organisms doing their thing. And their thing is creating soil function in a way that supports all of life on Earth. Now, isn't that inspiring, right? I find that really fascinating, and I really enjoy thinking about that, because it gives me an appreciation for how little one me is, right? And how much is there below our feet. So this right here, I would say, is one of the most important things that I would love for everybody to remember, because when you start talking to a farmer or a technical service provider to work with them to try to get soil health happening, if you think about that megacity, and then you think about some of the conventional ag practices that some of you know more about than others, right? If we disturb that soil, it's a little bit like an earthquake. Now, soils are more resilient than our houses, but we want to be able to maintain those continuous pores to the extent that we can, and we want to be able to maintain that habitat for all of these organisms to the extent that we can. Who are all those critters living down there, and what are they doing? The soil food web is something that we can talk about, right? So this schematic here is one way of looking at all of the organisms and how they depend on each other. And what I want to point out in this web here is that it all starts with the sun, right? You might hear there's too much carbon in the air. Oh, carbon is such a problem. I mean, it's not, right? It came from the soil originally, right? All of the fossil fuels we've burned, that was plants that were growing back long ago, right? And those plants turned into fossil fuels, and okay, now we've burnt them and put them back in the air. Well, there's no problem with that carbon, except we need to put it back in the soil. How do we do that? Well, one really good mechanism that is very tried and true, because it's how things evolved, is plants, right? All plants photosynthesize. They use the sun's energy to take carbon out of the air and put it below ground. And that is how everything lives and creates soil function. So the very act of taking that carbon out of the air and putting it below ground and feeding all of these organisms doesn't just help solve climate change, but it also helps keep all of these organisms alive and keeps that whole ecosystem functioning and produces all of those other functions that we want from soil, right? We're not just looking for one thing from soil. We're looking for all of those functions that we want. And we can do that if we just can help plants grow as much as possible. Now, if you think about conventional agriculture, if you think about sort of a lot of our crops, right? We plant a crop maybe in the spring, let it grow all season, harvest it, and then we're done, and there's nothing there for the winter. Or in some of the systems in the West, where there either is enough rain or is enough irrigation water, there's crop after crop after crop, but all of the above ground biomass is harvested and the crops are relatively small. So then we're not putting a lot of organic matter back into the soil, because we're not getting a whole lot of rooting happening, and those roots are only around for a short time. And so when we have systems like that, where we're not continuously feeding the soil with plant roots or with additional organic matter that we bring in, we end up kind of starving these organisms. And so that's one of the things when we start talking about soil health, we need to think about, okay, how do we feed those billions underground? How do we make sure that they do well, so that they build that aggregate house that we talked about, so that they build that mega city and do all of the things that we want them to do? So I keep having, sorry about that. There we go. Okay. So one of the things that's really critical about good structure, that's also really relevant to the extreme weather that we've been getting a lot, is as we get stable aggregates, what we're looking for is to build basically a sponge with really nice open continuous pores, right? Here's a healthy soil, and the water is infiltrating at the surface. And I'll tell you what, 10 inches per hour, there are soils that can very easily take in a 10-inch per hour rainstorm. That's quite the rainstorm. We can't control whether that rainstorm happens or not. But if we have resilient, highly stabilized soils that are functioning well, that have these continuous pores, that water can go in, which means it's not going to run off, which means it's not going to create a flood. So we want those really well aggregated soils that allow that water to infiltrate, to get sucked up into all of these little sponge aggregates, so that that water is then there when the next drought hits, so that those plants can stick around longer. And we want some of that water to go all the way down and refill our groundwater. That can't happen if the water doesn't go in the first place. And a lot of our current agriculture damages the ability of our aggregates to remain stable. So they fall apart. All those little pieces end up filling in these pores. And what we get is a very compacted surface layer. And when we get those heavy rainstorms, that water just can't go in, because the smaller those pores are, the smaller, the slower that infiltration is going to be. So we really want to avoid a situation where our soil basically turns into something like a roof where all the water just goes off. We're wanting that water to go in. The microbes need that water, the roots need that water. During that drought, those plants that hopefully have very deep growing roots need that water. So, a little bit about soils, right? Soils all across the country are different. And so there are different soil types. Those are inherent properties. Some soils are inherently a little more resilient. Some soils are inherently a little less resilient. But management really controls a lot of the function of our soils. Now, resilience is the ability of, and the rate of a soil to be able to return to its pre-disturbance state. So if we have a soil that's functioning at 100% capacity, whatever that capacity might be for that particular soil, and we have some kind of disturbance event, say it's a really heavy rainstorm, a soil with high resistance is going to keep functioning just fine. A soil with low resistance, but high resilience is going to dip in function for a bit, right? Because it's got low resistance, it can't quite maintain its rate of function. But then if it has high resilience, resilience is the ability of that soil to go back to its original function with a relatively short amount of time. If, however, we have a soil that is low in resistance, so it takes a hit, it gets damaged by the disturbance event, but it also has low resilience, well, now that means that it can't really get back to its original function. And out west in particular, there are a lot of really fragile soils. A lot of the native rangelands, when they get disturbed, we haven't figured out how to bring them back yet. And so there are a lot of issues like that where when we create a management disturbance that's too much for the ecosystem to handle, some soils, we don't really know how to manage them yet. Other soils, we can bring them back, and soil health management is what brings them back to a point where they are resilient, where they can regain that function despite disturbance events. So you might be wondering, okay, well, so how would I know, right? And we're going to have a whole session on soil health assessment later in this week. But for right now, I just want to at least briefly share a few pictures with you so that you know a little bit about what to think about when you're thinking about soil function loss, right? How might you tell? And basically, if you're seeing big rills in the soil like this, that much erosion, that's not just, oh, there was some rain and that always happens. That's the sign of a really degraded soil. When you see plants washing out like this, when you see cracking like this during a drought, when you see if you're putting a spade in the ground and you bring up that soil and you've got parallel cracks like this and it looks really massive and dense, that's a soil health issue. If your tractor sinks in like that, well, to some extent you probably plowed it too wet, but also when your soil is of poor health, that's much more likely to happen than when you've got a soil that's doing pretty well. Here are some additional signs, right? You can read through this list. A lot of these things are things that people who don't explicitly seek out the innovative farmers who are managing healthy soils, you see these things and you just think, well, that's just soil. That's just what happens with agriculture, right? Like that's just, soils just do that, right? But I'm here to tell you that actually generally not, right? Because our soils, when they are covered in plants, lots of diverse plants, when they've got roots in them year-round ideally, those soils remain functioning well and they don't crust over like this, and they don't tend to rut up quite like this, and they don't plow up cloddy, and they don't have cracks like this, right? These are signs of soils that are really struggling to maintain their function. High disease pressure, high pest pressure, we're going to talk more about some of these outcomes of managing poor soils. all signs that these soils are degraded from poor management. And, one of the things we have to be aware of here, people have managed the soils in the ways that they could. Farmers are doing the best that they can. It can be really tricky, but we now know more. We know a lot more about the biology of healthy soils and the biology of what happens, right? So how did soils get there? It didn't just happen overnight. This is hundreds, if not thousands of years of degradation, but definitely the last decades, especially with larger and larger equipment, with monocultures, as we have caused more disturbance to larger areas of our land, as we've reduced soil cover, reduced rooting in the soil, something no longer integrating livestock and pasture back and forth as much as we used to, as biodiversity of land has gone down. We basically have seen this downward spiral of soil degradation over the course of especially the last bunch of decades. So as we manage the soil with these kinds of practices that have these results, we decrease soil organic matter, we increase erosion and compaction. So biological activity goes down, aggregate stability goes down, so we get more crusting and more surface compaction. That means we get less infiltration and less drainage and more erosion yet, which means we lose even more of our soil organic matter, more of our nutrients. That downward spiral has happened across the entire world. So I think sort of going through these fairly quickly, right? This kind of side-by-side is common across the country. You can see the same soil type managed very different ways, responding to that management in a way that creates vast differences in the soil's ability to function. So this particular slide is in New Hampshire. The next one is in Indiana, I believe. We have cover crops versus no cover crops, and that kind of a massive difference in water flow and in water quality coming off that field. As we go further west into drier regions, while we sometimes have those downpours, those thunderstorms, and we get that kind of runoff issue, also dust storms start to become a really important piece. And those can be managed, again, with having really good soil cover, maintaining better organic matter management so that we have stable aggregates, because when you have a stable aggregate, that can't blow away. It's stuck together, and so it's way too heavy to blow away. Infiltration differences in Brookings County, South Dakota, right? The no-till versus conventional till fields side by side. On the right, we've got a field that you basically can't get through. And on the left, you have a field that you could actually drive on. The next slide, resilience, drought impacts with soil health management in Ohio back in 2012. Some of you may have heard of a farmer, Dave Brandt. He's pretty famous by now. He's at the time had 40 years of no-till winter cover crops. And during that very droughty year, he managed to get 144 bushels per acre of corn. And his neighbor probably had about 40 to 80 bushels in a system where he was doing a lot of tillage and no additional organic matter being added to that soil. And then the next slide, one of those side-by-side examples in Nebraska. On the left, there was no cover crop. On the right, just with 1 year of radishes in the fall, you can see the massive difference in the amount of erosion. Just in that picture, you can really visually tell that that soil is functioning better. And that's not from very much cover cropping, so you can actually get quite a bit of difference from just a year of cover crop, and that difference builds over time. So kind of wrapping up the benefits of healthy soils, right? We invest in managing for soil health, and what we get from that is a huge list of benefits, right? All of these things listed here, I'm not going to read through them all, but all of these things listed here are things that we can get when we manage our soils to function appropriately. Our soils become more resilient. They become easier to manage as we manage them better. They have fewer pest issues. They maintain our ecosystems in better shape, right? So all of these benefits come from managing for healthier soils across the country. Now, some of these, if we could manage to get most of our agriculture adopting these systems, we would be a lot better off. So next slide, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the 4 soil health principles, because when you all get to experience Kate Rotler and Marlon Winger tomorrow, having this in the backs of your minds will really help with understanding where they're coming from. In particular, Marlon, who will share a lot about particular practices and how they get adapted in the kinds of systems that he works in across the West. So the 4 soil health management principles are nationally accepted principles that we defined at NRCS, and that are pretty well adaptable to systems across the country. You will sometimes hear people talking about a 5th principle of integrating livestock. I like to argue that that's part of maximizing biodiversity. So those 4 principles are to minimize disturbance, right? We don't want to disturb physically, biologically, or chemically the soil, because then we're influencing that megacity of life, and we don't want to cause a human disturbance that damages the ability of all of those organisms to do what they need to do. We need to maximize soil cover. That's like a protective roof, right? We want to let the water through, but we want to maximize soil cover that protects the aggregates and that protects the soils and the organisms in it from temperature extremes. And so that cover can be anything from the stubble remaining from a previously growing crop, to living canopy over that soil, to a mulch that's put across the surface, like in a lot of vegetable systems. But we want that to be an organic layer. A 3rd principle, to maximize biodiversity. We really need more diversity back in our systems. Our agriculture has seriously declined in diversity, and that causes strain on the resilience of our systems, because one pest comes through, think of the COVID of corn, right? What would happen to our many, many, many acres of corn if we suddenly had one pest that came through that all of that corn couldn't be resistant to, right? So we need more diversity in our systems. We need multifunctionality, and we need to maximize continuous living roots. That's pretty difficult in some of our systems, right? If we plant in the spring and we harvest in the fall and we don't have anything else growing there, that's kind of the standard still in agriculture. There's still very little cover cropping. We're looking to maximize continuous living roots in the soil, ideally year round. Some parts of the West are very nicely situated for that and can really make that happen. Other parts of the West are, you have very cold winters and it can be hard to keep things growing. But if at least the soil is covered in some kind of a cover crop or some kind of a crop that makes it through the winter, where there is living root mass holding the soil in place, that's really going to make a big difference. So those are the 4 principles. And I always like to say, there's caveats. Those 4 principles have to be adapted to the particular production system, the soils, and the climate of any particular farm that's adopting those principles. But practices can be adopted to meet those principles and to fit into a given farm context. So we have to adapt these principles in context, and we have to adapt other, use of technology, use of nutrient and pest management to that particular system and to that particular farmer. Some farmers, some ranchers are really excited about trying new things, other ones not so much. And so the way that you work with a producer to make those 4 soil health management systems principles be implemented on the farm, the way that you do that with a particular producer is going to be different depending on all of these variables. But these 4 principles are nicely universal, and I would argue can create healthier soils in any system across the world. It's just, the devil's in the details. The rubber hits the road in the actual system with those adaptations. Next slide. So our goal then is to create win-win soil health management systems that become commonplace, right? We're trying to create a new conventional agriculture here, frankly. we're looking for this to become the new norm. Right now, our conventional agriculture, what we think of when we think, okay, what's conventional? We think of a lot of tillage, we think of a lot of bare soils, we think of monocultures, right? That's not sustainable. We can't continue to let it be that, because I don't think that we're going to have the food security and the water quality and the water quantity and the air quality and all of those benefits if we don't change what we're doing. Humans have changed a lot of things, right? I bet most of you have cell phones in your pockets right now, but we haven't yet changed our agriculture wholesale, but there's a lot happening right now. So Bonnie, this is a series of animations, and so maybe just kind of go through all those. I'm taking that spiral that I showed you before, that degradation spiral, and turning it on its head, right? Upside down. Now we're doing the opposite. We're increasing diversity, we're increasing rooting, we're increasing soil cover, and we're decreasing disturbance. As we implement those 4 principles, we start to rebuild our organic carbon. We decrease crusting, decrease compaction, build up our aggregates again, build up our biological activity, increase our infiltration, et cetera, right? We go the opposite direction and we can rebuild our soil function. And so we can get to consistent quality crop yields and economic viability for our farms and resilience despite challenging climate events and other challenges. And we get a lot of environmental benefits with that. Next slide. So those principles are really about caring for your below ground livestock, right? Those principles, there are basically 2 things that biota need. They need a home, so we need to protect their home. So we need to protect soil structure and their access to water and air and an appropriate temperature. These organisms need food, and so we need to feed below ground life a diverse year-round diet, including all the energy and nutrients that they need. It's really as simple as that, except of course it's not totally simple, because adapting these systems to create a new approach to doing our agriculture is actually kind of tricky, and there are certainly some challenges with it, but we're making a lot of progress, and there's a lot of innovative producers, next slide, who are actually accomplishing implementing these soil health principles. So when we feed our organisms, we stimulate diversity, etc. When we protect their habitat, we create better aggregates and we rebuild that system. Next slide. I'm going to go through the next couple kind of fast so that I can give Bonnie and Rachel a chance to talk through a couple of things related to climate. And then I want to show you guys some demonstrations. So just briefly, what is a soil health management system? You're going to hear, especially Marlon, talk about soil health management systems a lot. And basically what that means is a collection of these various practices that improve soil health that are all integrated. So it's a collection of management practices that focuses on increasing soil carbon levels and improving or regenerating soil health by addressing all 4 soil health management principles. So that's the key, right? A soil health management system, the idea is that you address all 4 principles. You try to improve on all 4 of those aspects. Next slide. And so you will hear more about specific practices. We'll talk a bit more about them in the session after Caitlin and Marlon tomorrow. And also they will both talk about some of the specific practices and how those work in the West. And you can basically take practices. You will see in this slide that each one of them has 3 numbers underneath it. So conservation cover, 327. What that is the practice code that NRCS has. And there's financial and technical assistance available from NRCS for farmers to implement these practices. So they can actually get paid to implement these practices if they qualify. And we went through all of the practices that work for healthy soils and assigned to them which of the soil health principles those practices address. And you can see that a number of them address all principles, and a number of them are specifically good for particular principles. So you would build a system by adapting these practices and adding enough of these practices that you can address all of the principles. Next slide. So you can just go through both of those slides quickly, right? We're really gaining momentum. There's a lot of soil health in the popular press. There's a lot of soil health in books these days. And really, I think that we can get to that new conventional agriculture where we're at this point where there's an acceleration of the number of people that know, the number of people that are excited and interested, the number of people who have already adopted these practices and can show that it is possible to be successful. And so I really envision that hopefully over the next 5 or 10 years, we'll get to a point where this becomes commonplace. This becomes the new norm, right? There's nobody that probably, well, may have very few people that still have a rotary phone, right? Everybody's got cell phones in their pockets. It's that kind of transition. It happened with phones over a couple of decades. This transition has been happening over a couple of decades. And I think we're just at the point where hopefully over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to get to a new convention where this is what generally is happening, that we have climate smart, soil health promoting agricultural systems. But to get there, it's going to take all of us, right? Next slide. Luckily, I've never seen this much funding put toward agriculture and climate, but it is really exciting that we actually have this kind of push right now, $3 billion going just toward the partnerships and climate smart commodities. And I'm going to skip the next 2 slides. So Bonnie, you can just kind of go through those briefly so that you can share a few insights, and then Rachel can. But we've got some solutions, right? Farmers are part of the solution. So go ahead, Bonnie.
Okay, cool. So we wanted to give you an idea of where we're at with some of the soil health practices. And so in the every 5-year agricultural census that the USDA does, they just this year had the most recent one, but that data will be available next year. So if we look at the last 2 most recent responses, farmers were asked how many acres they, I wonder, did you lose me?
No, we still have you.
Oh, okay. It's just the background sound changed, so I didn't know if you lost me. So, but so we, in the survey, the census asked farmers how many acres of their cropland are using cover crops. And so by state, then we can give percentages of cropland acres with cover crops. And so you can basically see those numbers are kind of low. And the main message here is that we need your help. So this is one of the reasons it's exciting to work with Land Trust, because it's another opportunity to help bring about change and more conservation practices on the landscape. And you might also be wondering, how much does soil health matter for climate change mitigation? And so I'm going to go through a few numbers for a case study we did for Oregon. We can look and see that agriculture contributes about 6.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. That's about 34% of Oregon's total greenhouse gas emissions. But if farmers successfully adopted these systems of practices, so I'll mention in a minute, on 80% of farmland, Oregon could mitigate a total of 3.3 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year for 20 years, or about half of Oregon's ag emissions. So that's pretty cool. So that's adding mulch. In this scenario, it's on 80% of specialty crop acres. And you can see what these other ones are. And if you add all these bars up, you get 3.3 million metric tons. And so you might be wondering where these numbers come from. And so they come from an AFT tool that's in collaboration with USDA ARS. And if someone else could put the link here into the chat, you'll also get these slides as well. So you'll have this link. And that's a tool that allows you to make estimates by county or by state for how much a conservation practice is going to have carbon benefits. And the way that we get those numbers is from another USDA tool that gives us estimates on a per acre basis for each practice that's climate and soil specific. And my colleague Rachel is going to come on and give you some more details about those tools. They're called Comet. So take it away, Rachel.
Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks for advancing the slides for me.
Yeah.
So USDA and Colorado State University, NRCS, built a tool called COMET, and you've probably heard of this. It's gaining in usage and popularity. So COMET stands for the Carbon Management and Emissions Tool, and it's an integrated web-based platform. And there are actually a couple of different tools, but the intent is to quantify and assess how conservation practices can mitigate climate change. So the different levels of the tools take a little bit of a different approach. COMET Energy is a really quick, simple calculation based on fuels reduction. So if practices lead to less tillage passes, less fuel consumption, then COMET Energy can be used to estimate what the greenhouse gas emission reductions would be from that. COMET Planner is another tool that estimates for each conservation practice and implementation on a kind of generalized basis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then COMET Farm is a more complex site-specific tool that brings together several different resources. Advance the slide for me, please. Thanks. So COMET Planner is a very commonly used tool as a quick and easy estimate. It is a generalized estimate that's based on a number of different areas, counties that make up MLRAs, major land resource areas that are defined by NRCS. And the actual acreage of those estimates kind of varies depending on the data available and how the MLRAs are selected and arranged. But these generalized estimates, these emission reduction coefficients, are calculated for those areas generally on average and reflect how much mitigation is possible. It is designed to be used in the initial planning process, so working with landowners to focus on climate smart practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the calculations on average are calculated if there are positive values, they're reflected in blue font and note an increase in carbon sequestered or decrease in greenhouse gases. So that is what we're looking for. And if the calculation is negative, it's in red font and it is a decrease, the estimate is a decrease in carbon sequestered or an increase in greenhouse gases. So that's not what we're planning for. And the process is really simple for COMET Planner. You link to the interface that's built into the web application. And in step one, you can name the project and select the state and county, and that will place it within the MLRA and the emission reduction coefficients that are related to that area. Step two, you select the class of conservation practices. So that could be croplands, grazing lands, cropland to herbaceous cover, restoration of disturbed lands, or woody plantings. And that opens up categories of those practices. And then, so you can select the practice. So for what I'm displaying here on the screen, we've selected cover crop. And then the implementation sort of dials in what kind of specifics can be planned for that practice. So for this example, I'm showing a legume seasonal cover crop with a 50% fertilizer nitrogen reduction on irrigated cropland. So for cover crop, there are actually like 12 or 15 different practices or practice implementation. So you can kind of dial in how specific your plan to implement that practice is based on the preset implementations. And then in step four, you define the acreage for each practice, and it's almost instantaneous where you get the output. There is a step 5 where you can download a report. So that calculation is the emission reduction estimate is the total acres of the practice that is planned on which the practice is planned, multiplied by the emission reduction coefficient. So pretty straightforward calculation. So for this example, I've selected multiple practices for a whole soil health management system that meets those principles. that Bianca was talking about. And what I started with was a non-legume seasonal cover crop with 25% fertilizer nitrogen reduction on irrigated cropland. And I defined the acreage at 50 acres just for this example. I also added fertilizer nitrogen management on irrigated croplands with a reduced application rate. And then transitioning from an intensive tillage system to a no-till or a strip till on irrigated cropland. And then lastly, I integrated a perennial crop rotation into the system on the 50 acres. And so the output there calculates the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered or emitted. So we are seeing blue calculations. So these are all in tons of CO2e per year. And so the blue number is the positive number. That's what we're looking for. So we are sequestering more carbon. And then nitrous oxide, there's some sequestration in CO2e for tillage and just the tillage operation. And then they have the total CO2e. So overall, this system of practices is sequestering 33 tons of CO2e per year. So we can start with that as a base to review this whole soil health system and its potential mitigation benefits. There's also the option to download that report. So that's Comet Planner. It really is pretty user-friendly, and just a few five or six steps depending on how complicated the conservation plan is, and then you get an estimate. It is generalized and based on those averages of the emission reduction coefficients. And a little more in-depth process and tool is Comet Farm. So this takes into consideration site-specific information, and it's intended to be a whole farm assessment of the greenhouse gas inventory. It is based on the DACENT model and includes how the DACENT model looks at the time step of carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling, but it also pulls in data from the Sergo database. So you actually define the area of the fields in which you're implementing these practices. And it pulls the soil specific data from NRCS's soil database. It includes weather. You can define different operations, production systems. You can include cropland, forestry. There's a livestock module, and then really fine tune the management. And Comet Farm is a little more data entry heavy because you do need a lot of history. It goes back to 20 years from the baseline. So you start the baseline in the year that you're planning and design the system of practices with the details. And those details are pretty in depth too, depending on the module you're working in. So you get some management history, you get a baseline with the details, and then a proposed practice for 10 years is projected. So it's more in depth. It gives you more ways to look at the details of the system, and does require a little more input, but the details that come out are also more accurate and finely tuned to the whole operation. And the Comet team has been working on this for a long time, and they have just a ton of resources that are available on the help page. There are live virtual trainings that you can sign up for. They have, I think, one a week with the different modules. There are also tutorials you can walk through, video recordings of the trainings, and even demonstration projects that you can pull into Comet Farm and then kind of manipulate as you work through it. So lots out there to help work through building a scenario. So I think we're in pretty good position to kind of take some time to think about a couple of questions. And I didn't design these as a poll, but more of like an interactive discussion if you have thoughts to share. A couple of questions to think about are, what challenges do you anticipate when talking with farmers about climate change? And how can Comet Planner be used to inspire more conservation practices or inspire farmers to adapt practices that impact climate? So if anyone wants to put a comment in the chat or take a moment, you can also unmute yourself and interact on these questions, or take them home with you and think about them for tomorrow.
This is an interesting, question, and there's lots of different kinds of farmers, right? So, I mean, I'm trying to put my head around. We've been working with lots of farmers in stewardship planning to help them incorporate these kinds of practices that we will monitor, as a land trust, because we're protecting these places in perpetuity. And so, I think the challenges I anticipate or that I experience have mostly to do with changing the way people have been doing things for a long time, and going from a way they've been practicing agriculture to something else. And I think what I'm taking from here is just a nice way to encapsulate some of all the benefits to making some of these changes. And then I guess this planner and other information from here so far is the kind of stuff I'd like to sit down with our local conservation district team or something like that and say, how are we aligning here? Like, if these are our main, this is a framework of thinking about this stuff. How does this work with some of your programs, and how can we imagine more of these particular practices being implemented on the farms that we have relationships with?
So we have a couple of comments in the chat. That one from our colleague Knowledge Murphy, who's based in the Pacific Northwest. What ways are you addressing farmers who refuse to acknowledge climate change in a more politically conservative area? Has anyone had experience navigating that difficult conversation?
I can chime in, but also curious to hear from non-AFT folks on your experience as well. My previous job was as a climate communication specialist in Western Pennsylvania, so Appalachia, fossil fuel country. And working with farmers, one of the things that I found was helpful was to focus on the solutions. And so to kind of skip ahead maybe in the usual conversation from what's the issue, who's causing it, whose fault is it, because then people can just sort of feel blame, even if you're not blaming people. And, if not using the word climate change helps you get in the door, if you ask them about, a recent heavy rain event, or the warm winter, mud season, things that they're living through, they'll talk about climate change, but we're just not using the word. And so if that helps me get a foot in the door, and then we talk about solutions and then building resiliency to those extreme events that they're experiencing, that might be the kind of motivation, rather than the kind of motivation that's like, hey, you're helping us meet the Paris Climate Accord. Like, no, that's usually not a good talking point in a conservative area. But so focusing on solutions and how resiliency helps that farmer, not somebody else necessarily, can help. And I think people can be really afraid to talk about it in conservative areas because we imagine it'll turn into something like you see on TV, when really in real life, it's people usually are, we say in the Midwest nice, on the ground one-on-one. It's different than what you see on TV when they talk about climate. Curious to hear what others' strategies are in conservative areas to talk with farmers about it.
I would say from my years managing the Resource Conservation District here in Central California, the focus was very much like you characterize it. What are the outcomes that soil healthy practices deliver, and do those outcomes help them meet sometimes it's regulatory pressure, water quality, orchard runoff, groundwater infiltration, those more tangible, somewhat similar, factors to climate change, but you relate it to, the pressure that they're trying to satisfy. Is it regulatory pressure? Is it some folks are into it for the soil health period, but typically what we find is that it's more about water quality, reduction of sediment movement off the property. We're really looking at it from a very site-specific landowner, farmer perspective.
Thanks, John. I also think it's really helpful to focus on the adaptation and resilience building benefits of these practices, and then, additionally add those that may provide some mitigation to tie it into the bigger climate perspective, if there's, interest in that kind of type of approach. Anyone else want to share any challenges?
I'll just share one more on that theme, is that I guess one way I approach this is I just acknowledge, so as things are getting hotter and drier in the summer, and they're going to get warmer and wetter in the winters, what are some of the things you're doing, or how can we work together on making sure that we're prepared for that. And when I frame it like that, it's just kind of matter of fact, because it is, then I don't really get a lot of pushback or anything. It's just a matter of how are we getting ready for this? Because we are, as a land trust, constantly thinking 20, 50, 100 years out with these projects and these properties. And when we bring that perspective to them, when they might be in the middle of the season, that seems to be a really effective way to help them think long term.
Yeah, it's interesting that the pressures across the country are different. I think a lot in the South, because I introduced myself but didn't mention that I'm based in Florida. And I've lived in the West in a couple of states, but the difference is the changes in seasons and planting times and nighttime temperatures. These are all things that we're facing in the South, and in the West, water pressures and other issues that really can help people relate to what's happening on the ground where they are. I think it's a good angle.
I'll just chime in and say there's often pushback about climate, but there's not as much pushback about soil health. And so kind of across the country, we're at a point where soil health is in every farm magazine that you can find. It doesn't really matter whether it's rural or urban, doesn't matter whether it's this side or that side of the political sides. It's people are starting to understand soil health as something beneficial. Everybody can relate to health. And so really focusing on that and all of the benefits like we're talking about here, I have found that to be helpful, because it tends to open people up to the potential and to the inspirational possibility, rather than the, gosh, this is so scary, I don't even want to touch it kind of mentality that comes about when you think about all of this extreme weather. I want to add a few other topics to the discussion. We've got a few minutes left. Would love anybody to chime in on any of the other parts of this. Have you seen poor soils in your community? Do you feel like you can use what you heard here today with the landowners that you're working with on a daily basis, or with partners that you may be working with? Have you experienced healthy, high functioning soils? Do you have those particular innovators in your community that have that to show? And are you thinking of, how you might use some local examples in your work or anything else like that? What are your thoughts on the usefulness of what you heard here today and integrating this whole space of soil health, climate, water, resilience?
I think one thought I'm having about kind of how to put what I'm learning here into practice is just looking at the like side-by-side images that we got to see, which were really helpful, and thinking about those ways to identify soil that's not functioning at its capacity. I'm thinking if I look at, say, a farm field, we saw with those side-by-side images kind of two extremes of what the condition of the soil could be, but like how much, like where on the spectrum would a soil need to be for it to be considered like, oh, you have like a serious erosion problem, versus like, oh, like you're experiencing a little bit of erosion. Like how bad does it need to be before it's something that farmers are likely to be interested in resolving, or that should be pointed out?
That's a really excellent question. And we actually have a whole 45-minute session on soil health assessment. And soil health assessment is an evolving space. Over the last 20 years, we've gone from basically soil nutrient testing being available and nothing else being known, and there not really being anything out there, to now NRCS has ways to send somebody out to do in-field assessments, to send somebody out and gather samples for a laboratory assessment and even pay for it and manage based on that. But yeah, we will spend 45 minutes on that, and we'll kind of really get into the nitty-gritty of how do you assess where the soil is at, what kinds of tools are available, what kinds of frameworks are there for interpreting right now, what are the limitations and the opportunities with those right now.
I can mention not a specific farmer that I've worked with, but I know in Sonoma County, there was a story, or we've been having like severe rain events this year. And so there was a news article that I saw soon after some of these severe rain events that showed a side-by-side comparison of some photos from vineyards, and how the vineyards that had been managed with healthy soil practices like looked pretty normal, like a day after the flooding, and then the vineyards that had not were like eroded and they had like a lot of standing water. So I thought that was a great example.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. If you happen to have links for any of those that you can dig up and send to us, we're always collecting those kinds of side-by-sides from across the country because they tend to be really great visual examples.
So thank you ever so much, Bianca and Rachel and Bonnie. That was fantastic, as always.